Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Understanding MENA. We have previously discussed private military companies and to what extent they are engaged in warfare in the Middle East. And today I'm very proud to introduce a very special guest, Mr. Mohhamed ElMofty, who's joining us today from London. He is a PhD researcher at Kingston University, and his work focuses on private military and security companies and the notion of accountability and the free market. So the tug of war between, are these companies accountable, or to what extent are they commodities that are in a sense up for grabs? I think this is a very interesting topic. So firstly, Mohammed, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
And yes, I think we will now listen to your lecture. It's going to be very interesting. So please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So just a quick background about myself. I recently just completed my defense, and in the process of tidying up my thesis. And for the past 5 years, I've been looking at private military companies, and my work, my thesis has some theoretical elements to it, which I will spare you for the purposes of this webinar. But just to give you a quick idea, my thesis sort of looked at how accountability has been redefined or renegotiated under the sort of neoliberal regime. And I used some of the works of Michel Foucault, particularly his focus on neoliberalism, to try and understand sort of the gaps in the literature with respect to accountability.
Excellent.
And I thought, for the purposes of today's webinar, that we can sort of just remove that theoretical element and just hone in on the accountability aspect of private military companies, and examine to what extent are they held accountable, and sort of what are the measures that are being used to hold them responsible. What are sort of the liabilities that fall upon them, and how are these sort of viewed with respect to, shall we say, democratic accountability standards. So without further ado, I'd like to sort of jump right into, private military companies. What are they? A brief history and some anecdotal insights about them. So the profession of mercenary is some would say the second oldest profession, and obviously the term mercenary has been applied, shall we say, quite frequently when referring to private military companies. That we've heard everything, that they're guns for hire. They're merely soldiers of fortune. But I think that that sort of reduces the complexity of private military companies, because private military companies these days, they are they occupy such a large presence in modern warfare. So according to the global private military service market size, status, and forecast for between 2020 and 2026, the global private military market has reached approximately $186 million in 2019, and is expected to reach almost 252 by 2026. So that's a compound annual growth rate of 4.4% between 2021 and 2026. And so, this, I think when we look at that, we should, it should sort of like we should pause and really look at the significance of how big, the private forces are with respect to national and international security, and the role that they occupy within that sphere. And I think, one thing why we need to sort of focus on that is because private military companies are, constantly, they are reshaping wars and they're reshaping the rules of engagement. And obviously that sort of stems from the fact that private military companies are taking on tasks that have been previously performed by the government. And so, that shift from the sort of from public to private is also marked by a shift in the norms and a shift in how we perceive things with respect to security and sovereignty. So obviously those are two big topics which I will, I'm not going to get too much into detail, but it is interesting to acknowledge that the shift, the outsourcing of military operations, as I said, it marks a shift in the norms, and also it's marked by changes in the legitimacy of these actors. So that's, I think that's an interesting sort of notion to look at, because the acceptance of PMCs also basically means a change in the norms, and also in a way it legitimizes them as a essential component of the state security apparatus. And then obviously there's also the question, if they are becoming legitimate and if they are becoming an essential component of the state security apparatus, then are they judged in the same way as state troops, or do they enjoy special status under international law? And I think there's been some very interesting sort of developments in that area. So Anna Leander she wrote quite extensively on that, and she mentions that the reason why private military companies seem to enjoy some sort of immunity under international law comes from sort of 3 points, and that is any practices that relate, because they are involved in discourses and practices that relate to risk and security. And the second is that the exercise of the state's monopoly on violence and market governance make up the second two, the other two sort of points of why private military companies seem to enjoy special status under international law. And also one thing that she mentions, which I think is quite critical for us to be aware of, is that this leaves kind of shall we say a question mark with respect to accountability. And one thing that then this leads to is the idea of exceptionalism, and so that the result is that when the coexistence of PMCs and their sort of impunity and as she mentions, sort of the legal contestation because of the innovations done by
by international law, perhaps, and also the change of norms regarding, as you were mentioning, accountability of PMCs and to what extent they are held accountable under international law.
Right. Yes. So I believe that when we look at these factors, about norm changes and sort of legal impunity against actions. Obviously, first thing that springs to mind is the Iraq case, and for me anyway, because I think obviously, as we all know, Iraq is kind of like the one of the most recent examples of the deployment of PMCs on such a large scale, and it also marks the sort of the changing nature of the way the U.S. And the British governments have conducted warfare, at least in modern times. So,
Definitely.
you know, what makes the use of PMCs in Iraq so unique is that obviously not only did we witness through documentations, time and time again by, several, articles and investigations conducted by the U.S. government itself, and of course, we have an abundance of literature and documenting exactly what it is that the private military companies engaged in while in Iraq. So I think these sort of highlights which we attribute to the Iraq War make it such a unique case when we want to examine, private military contractors and their accountability. And obviously, when we mention private military companies in Iraq, we also have to mention the Coalition Provisional Authorities Order number 17. Now, just a quick background: the Coalition Provisional Authority was the interim government instated by the U.S. to overlook the sort of reconstruction and the rebuilding of Iraq following the initial stages of the invasion. So one thing that the CPA or one thing the CPA has mentioned in Order number 17 is that coalition forces and foreign liaison mission, their property, funds, and assets shall be immune from Iraqi legal process. Now, obviously, this is an interesting facet because private military companies were operating on Iraqi soil. However, everything that they were doing was immune from the Iraqi legal system. Oddly enough, the Order number 17 also mentions that in the event that an act is committed whereby Iraqi legal, the Iraqi legal framework should or cannot prosecute, then the coalition may request from the parent state, which is in this case either the US or the UK, a waiver of jurisdiction to try such act or acts under Iraqi law. And in such cases, no legal process shall be commenced without the written permission of the administrator of the CPA. So immediately we start to then see how accountability is becoming sort of reformulated, and this reformulation, as I will as we will see in the next slide or so, is marked by also a change in governance and the mode of governance, with this change in mode of governance, there's also a change in the way accountability is framed and is presented.
If I may, this is very interesting. You've hit on something quite interesting, which is accountability, and it sounds as if we should not look at only the PMCs and how they address accountability. I think this is what's so interesting about your research, that you also mentioned the CPA, and it sounds as if they actually put their foot in here and they formulated resolutions that would minimize accountability. So perhaps you could even say that before the PMCs were going to come in, the issue of accountability was already being mismanaged or tangled up, if you will, by the CPA. That's a very interesting point.
I agree. You're absolutely right. I mean, as you mentioned from the get-go, accountability was kind of a murky situation. Who are these? Who will these companies answer to, and how will they be prosecuted? And in the event of breaches of Iraqi or international and humanitarian law. But as we've seen, multiple incidents involving PMCs misconducts, negligence, transgressions, have went by, somewhere put into the spotlight and even taken to the legal system, while others sort of just remain, I guess you should say, they remain up in the air, and it just sort of compounds the problem of how do we define accountability. So obviously one of the most notorious incidents that have taken place is the Nisour Square killings, where a convoy of Blackwater, which is now known as Academy, opened fire on civilians due to what they perceived was some sort of threat. However, the main thing that stuck out of this is that in addition to the over 30 dead individuals and the hundreds of others who were injured, that even though some of these, later on, the contractors who were responsible for this incident were taken to court, and some were given some very stiff sentences, which are now being I guess they're now in the process of looking over the reopening the case, as the contestation is around the area of, okay, so was there actually a threat? Did these contractors act out of necessity, or did they were they instructed to open fire by the company, or who's giving the orders here, and are they acting out of their own accord, or is there someone sort of shall we say looking, just moving the pieces, and I think for me that stands out remarkably, because if we were to sort of break this scenario down and just try to understand what accountability, who's to be held accountable, is it the parent state, the US, or is it the company itself, or is it the contractors? And one thing that I'm sort of working on now in my corrections is trying to, in my thesis that is I'm trying to look at accountability on multiple levels. So you have accountability at the level of the state. You have accountability, at the for actions. You have accountability for employers, and you have accountability towards employees. So there's sort of like this multi-level of accountability that I think we, in order to really understand where, how we can, pinpoint liability, or how can we assign responsibility to individuals, we then have to break down accountability into sort of different levels. And obviously, with Iraq has, the Iraq case has now been over for, well, the fighting has obviously been, sort of, the stages where private military companies were heavily involved has been a long time ago now. However, there's it's interesting to also sort of compare and contrast with some recent examples of PMC deployment. So for example, one of the most recent sort of mentions of private military companies has been the Russian group known as the Wagner Group, or the Wagner Group, and they have, it's really interesting to see how these particular contractors are being looked at, and what sort of status do they receive. And there's been some research on this case, and even some very interesting articles published. So for example, Reuters published not too long ago about these Russian fighters who are basically designated as I guess you could call them either contractors or mercenaries, and something which is, I thought something which I thought was very interesting is that despite the article mentions that despite their unofficial status, they operate in coordination with Russian military and are given privileges back home normally available for serving soldiers. Now, this, you've got two issues here. First you have the unofficial status, and then you also have, there's this idea that they're being given privileges that are given to soldiers. So what does that say with respect to the state's monopoly on the use of legitimate force, which something which you're very well versed in, given your book, and also the idea that who are these soldiers answering to, right? And are they an extension of the state, or are they merely an apparatus that is used to provide the state with some sort of, shall we say, special status? It's. I believe there is a legal term that is used for that, sort of plausible deniability.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
it's a very good point.
So we need to look at this as we need to examine this as two facets. First, there's there's the changing nature and the state's monopoly on violence, and then there's also the idea that, are these companies private? Because it would seem that they are sort of working in coordination with the state, and in fact they are carrying out missions for the state. So it's sort of this murkiness of public and private, I think, could prove to be problematic when it comes to identifying, again, we go back to the main point, identifying accountability and who should be held responsible. And if in the case, in case of breaches of, shall we say, in cases of breach of international or an international and humanitarian law, was that done in as a one-off by the private contractors, someone who's shall we say a loose cannon who carried out something that they shouldn't have, or are they simply sort of carrying out missions for the state without sort of the state itself getting its hands dirty? So I think that's a fascinating aspect to look at.
Definitely.
And also one question we have to ask is, are states becoming more reliant on private military companies? And I think that perhaps this is, I think I would answer in the affirmative, simply because it's states can no longer go into war without sort of without the help and the capabilities of private military companies. So Peter Singer, who wrote so much on the topic, and in fact published a very interesting piece that says, the title I believe was "Can't Win with Them, Can't Go to War Without Them." I think once that reality sinks in, that we can really understand that PMCs are not just an auxiliary to the state apparatus; they are an essential component of the state security apparatus.
Yes, they are. Yeah, definitely.
And so now that we've sort of now that we've, shall we say, established in our own rights that PMCs are now an essential component excuse me, of the state security apparatus, how then do we really define what accountability is? What is, who do these contractors answer to, and are they, do they have certain legal status under the under international law? And more importantly, I think we need to look at sort of what the mechanisms that are being used to determine liability, because I think hopefully we will get into this discussion later on, that the mechanisms that are being used to sort of enforce accountability are really the crux of the matter. They are the they are the lie at the heart of the problem. Which is this sort of like shift of governance through this sort of I'll very quickly dive into a bit of theoretical elements. I think it's the sort of the neoliberalization, this deployment of neoliberalism, which is, we shouldn't be reduced merely as an economic system, but it's also a mode of governance. It is a way to sort of look at and judge things from an economic lens or perspective. So once we identify that, then something else becomes quite clear, and that is accountability has been renegotiated as accountability through data, metrics, and performance assessments. So as you can see here, I have this one thing that my examiner sort of suggested for me for my thesis, that to look at accountability, and that is precisely what the problem is. Accountability has now become a sort of shall we say, it's become an essential, it's become an essential part of modern governance. We have what's called the culture of accountability, as Jerry Muller mentioned in his book, 2018 book, The Tyranny of Metrics. He said we have this culture of accountability, and also there's this, I guess you could say, a distinct set of business-oriented ideas that sort of, that became the principles upon which the modern system of governance is focused, is founded upon. And so when we translate that into how private military companies are being held accountable, we can see the various sort of mechanisms and initiatives that have been taken that eerily rely on this idea, or on the renegotiated notion of accountability, on sort of always enforcing in the idea of performance assessments and metrics. So, for example, you have the establishment of the ICOCA, and you have, of course, the Montreux document. And without getting into too much details of the content of these of the Montreux document, or the code of the ICOCA, we can see more clearly that in order to determine accountability under this modern system of governance, we are actually looking at a model that's very similar to what the private sector does, which is to assess how things are done based on numbers, which in this case is quite problematic, because you cannot assess security in numbers. You have to assess security as a task that's carried, as a state task, in which you cannot simply reduce it to metrics and how well something is being done. You have to judge it from a, shall we say, democratic perspective. So you have the idea of democratic accountability, should be at the focus of security. But instead, we have this erosion of democratic accountability and its replacement with, accountability through data analysis.
Yeah, very interesting. I think also, as you mentioned, the International Code of Conduct Association and their attempts to create a code of conduct. I think there are some companies that have also their own codes of conduct, but of course then the question is, to what extent do they enforce it? As you said, the idea of accountability, counting the cost, evaluation through the private sector, and looking at things in terms of being for profit instead of through democratic accountability. I think that's a very interesting point.
Indeed. So, one thing that I would sort of just like to briefly mention is that, one thing that have sort of we need to look at as well is that a lot of what accountability is sort of, as I mentioned, it's sort of based on this, shall we say, managerialism, approach of managerialism, right? And we also have the rise of things such as new public management strategies whereby you have a very sort of business-oriented approach of determining how things should work, rather than say looking at security as being security and sovereignty of the state as sort of like I want to say like the raison d'être of the state security apparatus, and this idea also like we also in addition to security we also I think need to examine the idea of sovereignty. That is obviously a different topic, but it also I think the two are interrelated, and that it could be perhaps difficult to move forward with assessing security and accountability without also assessing the state sovereignty and what threat do private military companies pose in relation to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that engaging presentation. I think it's a very important topic. And of course, Iraq remains a significant case study. You mentioned the sort of square as, I think, a significant instance of, in a sense, PMC brutality. So this was a massacre in which 17 civilians were killed. I think hundreds, if not millions, the whole country of Iraq, I think, was affected by this incident. And it's one of the cases that shows why PMCs have a negative image. Are there any other instances that are similar to this sort of square that have involved PMCs?
Right. Well, in fact, there are multiple incidents involving PMC's transgressions, but perhaps one that really stands out was the killing of 3 Iraqi guards by a Blackwater sniper. And according to the report which mentioned the incident, the sniper who was standing on the roof of Iraq's Ministry of Justice shot at the guard employed by Iraqi media, by an Iraqi media network, who was sort of standing on a balcony across an open traffic circle. And when other guards rushed to the aid of their colleague, they were also fatally shot. And so when the Iraqi when the Iraqi state tried to prosecute this, and obviously it was kind of clear that this was a direct transgression from the contractor. Apparently the U.S. government reached a different conclusion, and that they determined that based on the information from the contractors, the Blackwater contractors, who apparently said they were fired upon first, the State Department determined that their actions sort of fell within approved rules of governing upon approved rules governing the use of force. So
it's very interesting. It's also, if I may, it
Sure.
also is a reminder of the fact that although this incident happened in Iraq to Iraqis, they did not have much authority to seek justice. It was the US that was able to make the final decision and, in a sense, to reach a conclusion favorable to the private military company.
Indeed, and perhaps one other it goes back to the fact which I sort of mentioned earlier in my presentation, that through the CPA, and it being sort of the arbitrator on the ground in Iraq with respect to any incidents involving foreign contractors, that it seems that the problem starts at the base level, where an incident takes place, and rather than trying to immediately raise this issue and prosecute the culpable parties. Instead, you have this sort of arbitrator from the get-go that says, okay, here's what we're going to do. This could be prosecuted. This is not deemed. And even when it goes to the U.S. State Department, as this particular incident we just discussed, it sort of, as you mentioned, goes favorably or goes in favor of the private contractors. So in a way, we sort of begin to see in action how accountability is being renegotiated.
Indeed, very interesting. I think also it links back to other issues such as the language surrounding accountability. I think this is very interesting because you mentioned that, of course, PMCs are businesses. They are run or staffed with employees, and we have managers in various positions. So I suppose another question here is, does business language affect how these companies, because they are companies, how they view accountability?
I mean, I would definitely say yes, that is sort of a very strong factor that influences how accountability is perceived. Language, and that is when we talk about language, we talk about how private military companies are being viewed by the government, and how and in what capacity are they employed. And I think when we look at for example how the introduction of MPM, or new public management, as a governing mechanism to become an essential factor in how these companies are assessed and how their performance is measured. So it's the idea that the metrification of performance of private military companies, and the use of Elke Kramen had this fascinating articles that talk about performance and performativity, and she mentions how security, in the modern sense and through the use of private military companies, becomes a performative act, and the way contracts and are sort of drafted, and the way contractors are being judged is kind of like a performance, something that is has a repetitive nature, and you have all kinds of metrics and assessments, KPIs, key performance indicators, whereby this, of course, when we use these terms, when we use this language, immediately the nature of the subject completely changes, because as we sort of discussed earlier during the presentation, that security is about it cannot be something that you can measure. It has to be something that is a role that is well defined through the state's legitimate monopoly on violence.
Yes, exactly.
But now it sort of becomes this, as Kramer mentions, it becomes this kind of a performance, a repetitive act, whereby you can judge how well a company is performing through a set of sort of check boxes, and if a company checks all these boxes, for example, adhering to the code of conduct, which already is in and of itself kind of vague and not really enforceable, to holding individuals and entities responsible for their actions through measures, rather than actual liability that falls upon them.
Well, I think that's also another interesting point that we've mentioned, the nature of accountability, business language. And I think the next question is to look at the notion of hybrid warfare, especially as you mentioned, the Wagner Group is a group that seems to be quite aggressive. They are linked to the Russian state. Putin has been using them in Syria and in Libya. Recently, he even pulled Wagner Group rather pulled out of Libya, affecting Khalifa Haftar's gains in Tripoli quite negatively, I might add. So the question then becomes, are we seeing, in a sense, an era of hybrid warfare? So private military companies, are they truly private, or are they an extension of state foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and definitely, when we, in light of what's been happening with, Russian contractors, whether they be employed by the Wagner Group or some other, shadow private force, because that's kind of essentially what they are. I think you're absolutely right. We are seeing kind of a hybrid warfare in one sense, the state trying to accomplish certain, geopolitical goals, and on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the private sector, which kind of then becomes an extension or an arm of the state to be able to accomplish some of these goals without the threat of international the international legal system hanging over its head. Because if you can accomplish something without and having, like I mentioned earlier, plausible deniability, then effectively you're able to skirt international and humanitarian legal norms, and at the same time you have the private sector, in this case the private contractors, the companies, who are essentially profit entities, seeking to acquire business or become an integral part of the state security apparatus, whereby they are, the state has become completely dependent on them for due to their capabilities. Because this is one thing that I think we need to sort of look at, is the kind of capabilities that the private sector has that the government doesn't, and sort of how this hybrid of private and public then becomes the modern the modern way warfare is conducted.
Indeed. I think these are very interesting points. Accountability, the notion of hybrid warfare as well, and the notions that businesses are going to war on behalf of states. So I think this is a very interesting point to take up, and certainly warrants further discussion. So Mr. Mohhamed ElMofty of Kingston University, London, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to have you on.